This time it's 5 more of the scariest dirt bikes in history. A couple of months ago we released a video detailing what we thought were the 5 scariest motocross bikes in history. We've had literally hundreds of responses, many of which suggested bikes they thought should have been on the list. So let's do a second video we thought and include some of the videos that you guys have suggested. So here are 5 more of the scariest motocross bikes in history. The Suzuki RM500. Intended to replace the earlier TM series, Suzuki's RM series of bikes first arrived in 1975 in the form of the RM125. This was followed in 76 by the RM250 and 370. Compared to the earlier TMs, these bikes had much better power production, they were much more controllable, and far better chassis too. The RM370 would grow to 400 and then 465 into the late 70s and early 80s. Now the inclusion of the RM might surprise some people. After all, Suzuki had listened good to a lot of the criticism of the TM in the early 70s. And this bike was a completely different animal, much more placid, easily controllable, it's all relative, and with a far better chassis. And in fact it was probably one of the least powerful of all the major Japanese motocross bikes of the era. In 1983, Suzuki took the step of boring out the 465 to create a 492cc motor for the RM500. The bike had a bore and stroke dimensions of 88.5 by 80, compression ratio of 6.2 to 1, and used a 38mm flat-sided carb in standard trim. The bike also pioneered the use of full floating suspension, and this would be the best suspension system around for the next 5 or 6 years. The bike had a ground clearance of 370mm and a high seat height of 960mm. And it was said that the RM could turn inside pretty much any other bike of the period, which is a good thing because the bike, front and rear, still retained rather puny looking drum brakes. Although surprisingly, probably the scariest thing about the bike was the front suspension system. This was said to be overly soft and would have the effect of making the bike dive excessively under braking and weave sometimes under acceleration. So all in all, the RM was a great bike all round. It may not quite have had the power of the opposition, but it was still blooming powerful and could scare the willies out of somebody who wasn't used to that kind of performance. So does Suzuki's RM really deserve its place on the list? What do you think? Kawasaki KX500. Kawasaki introduced their KX500 model to replace the earlier SR500 in 1983. Early air-cooled models are quite rare now, and these were praised for their excellent suspension systems and good chassis, but much less so for the engine, which was often described as almost unrideable. So vicious was the machine's power delivery. In an effort to tame the beast and wave away some of that criticism, Kawasaki simply dropped the compression ratio. But ultimately this was a bike with a vicious streak, so much so that in 1985 they completely redesigned the engine to incorporate water cooling. And the following year they would redesign the engine again to incorporate the key IPS power valve system. And this was the first use of a power valve system on a motocross bike, even beating Yamaha to the punch on this one. This made the bike so easy to ride, relatively speaking, that it was able to beat Honda's more powerful, although much harder to ride, CR500, with its cartridge forks and all. The Liquid Cool variant used a 499cc engine with a bore and stroke of square dimensions 86 by 86, and the bike had a compression ratio of 8.4 to 1. And unlike early RM Suzuki's, the bike ran from the start a 5-speed gearbox. The KX500 would remain in production until 2004, but none would be quite as scary as that early air-cooled monster. Yamaha's YZ, or if you prefer YZ series. Yamaha released the YZ 465 in 1980 in an attempt to challenge the all-dominant Mako machines. And to some extent this was successful. The bike did rack a number of race wins under its belt. The engine was very torquey and user-friendly, although definitely not the most powerful. But it was a single-shot rear suspension system that really caught the eye on the bike. and while this did offer unmatched levels of travel, on the 465 this did not necessarily add up to good handling. Top racers of the day often describing the bike's handling as interesting, which translates for us mere mortals as truly terrifying at times. But nevertheless, the 465 was viewed as a pretty damn good motocrosser. So in a way it's almost surprising that after only 2 years of production in 1982, they introduced the YZ490 to replace it. 490 had of course an enlarged engine, but it also had a completely new chassis with a totally revised suspension system, which would give the bike much more predictable handling. The revised engine of course did offer more power, and this was the core of the problem for this bike and all the other bikes in the class during this period. The engines were becoming just too darn powerful. They were all so gnarly and difficult to ride that it was often possible to lap even quicker on a 250 than it was on an open class bike. And in the early days the YZ was indeed very successful. But unfortunately Yamaha very much rested on their laurels with the bike. There would be improvements over the years, particularly around the suspension and braking, but the bike would retain its air-cooled engine throughout the 1980s, long after all the major Japanese firms had switched over to water cooling. There would be the water-cooled YZM Works model of 1988, but of these only 6 were ever built. So the YZ series, or YZ series, does it earn its place? Certainly in the 465 form, which was interesting to say the least. But in all its forms, bikes of these periods were ludicrously powerful, and so were always damn scary. The CanAm MX Series. In the early 70s, Bombardier, the makers of CanAm motorcycles, decided to cash in on the then burgeoning motocross market. And in 1973 they released their first models. These were the MX 125, 175 and 250. 1976 would see the introduction of the MX3 series. These were actually only the second series of bikes, but they featured a series of improvements, including laid down shocks, which helped increase suspension travel. But unfortunately parent company Bombardier were trying to develop the bike on a shoestring. Subsequently the frame was very flimsy looking, and simply couldn't cope with the 35 horsepower produced by the 250 model. Legend has it that former Works BSA rider Jeff Smith tried the bike and declared it unrideable. Test rider Jimmy Ellis then tried the bike in a practice session. He found the bike incredibly difficult to ride and indeed crashed, injuring one of the spectators quite severely. It is at that point he declared the bike a widowmaker, and the name stuck. And so despite the bike's shortcomings, Bombardier put the bike into production anyway, and even increased the capacity to 370cc for use in the open class. The engine would eventually grow to 400cc in 1980. Thankfully by then, CanAm had really got to grips with the chassis, and the chassis on the later bikes was given much praise. By then, Bombardier had lost interest in producing motocross bikes at their own factories, so production was moved from Quebec to Great Britain in 1982 in a tie-up with Armstrong CCM, making the now very rare MX7 series the last Canadian-produced CanAms. The Mako 490. We did feature the 700cc Mako in a previous video, but this bike also has scared the hell out of an awful lot of people it seems. The Mako was founded in the Swabian region of Germany in 1926 and was primarily interested in car production. But post-World War II, they began production of lightweight motorcycles, moving into motocross or scrambles as it was in the 1960s. Mako were the pioneers of long travel suspension systems in the late 70s, and this together with the prodigious power of their 490 engine made them the bikes to beat throughout the late 70s and into the early 80s. The 490 ran a piston-ported 488cc air-cooled two-stroke engine with a bore and stroke dimensions of 86 by 83. It's said that it produced around 53 horsepower at the crank, which was then fed through those very hard-worked tyres through a 5-speed gearbox. The bike weighed in at just 245 pounds, and that combination of high power and light weight made the bike both difficult to beat and difficult to ride in equal measure. And having piston ported rather than reed valve induction made for a very hairy power delivery at that time. But the bike's all-round performance made it the bike to have in the early 80s. Unfortunately by 1981-82 the Japanese are starting to gain ground, and in 83 the company would go bankrupt. Fortunately the company would survive and continues to this day producing machines in low volume. What collections of bikes would you like to see us do a video on? Maybe you've got a bike we can use for a test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course, thank you very much for watching.